Hi guys, welcome back to TV Spoilers. Today I'm going to reveal you the update for Mariah for Dominic. Will Dominic be able to escape from captivity?
Young and the Restless spoilers that Mariah had crossed a line she once swore she would never touch again, and from that moment forward, Abby and Devon's world began to tilt as if the foundation beneath their home had been quietly removed. It wasn't the kind of chaos that announces itself with noise and spectacle, but the sort that seeps into every corner of a day until even breathing inside the same room feels cautious. Abby started watching Dominic the way you watch something priceless and fragile, convinced that one more shock could crack him in ways she wouldn't be able to mend. Devon, usually steady, became wired with a constant tension. Because he could see what was happening more clearly than he wanted to admit, Mariah was no longer just struggling. She was being driven by a warped certainty that turned desperation into direction. Dominic, a child who should have known only warmth and safety, had become the center of an adult truth too heavy and too cruel for a young mind. All it would take was one careless sentence, one misplaced reaction, one moment of lost control. And fear would root itself inside him where it could keep growing long after everyone insisted everything was fine. The most frightening part wasn't simply Mariah's presence, but the way she carried herself, coldly convinced. As if guilt and loss had been eating at her for so long that she needed to forge a personal law just to stay alive. Abby didn't see Mariah only as family anymore, not only as someone they had once trusted with tenderness, but as a storm that might wipe out the sense of home Dominic had finally found. Abby understood that if she responded wrong, if she snapped too soon or softened too late, Dominic would pay the price. She forced herself into calm, but it was the brittle kind, like thin ice over deep water. Beneath it was sleepless dread, the sickening awareness that every choice carried consequences, the brutal question of how someone who once knew sacrifice could turn love into possession. And Abby began to grasp the heart of it. Mariah didn't only want Dominic, she wanted absolution. She wanted to erase the day she gave up her son by rewriting the present as if the past could be undone. But the present wasn't blank paper. The present was a living child, forming memories, forming trust, learning what safety meant, and Abby could feel the ground shifting under all of it. Devon watched Mariah with an unease he couldn't hide. He understood how deep her wound ran because he knew what it meant to be reshaped by hard choices, to live with the haunting idea that the right decision could still feel like a personal death. But Devon could not afford to let empathy blur responsibility. Dominic had been the one thing he and Abby had tried to shelter from every adult storm. When Mariah disrupted their life, it wasn't just family drama. It was an invasion of Dominic's security. Devon noticed the smallest changes in the boy: an unexpected flinch, a hesitation in his eyes, a moment where he seemed unsure who to believe. And Devon went cold, because he knew children don't need a grand tragedy to be scarred. They only need fear repeated long enough for it to become a permanent imprint. Meanwhile, Mariah was trapped between two versions of herself: the woman who once let go because she believed it was best, and the woman now convinced she had been robbed of what was hers. She wasn't simply reliving memory was tightening around her throat every night. In those rare moments when Dominic slept in the back seat, Mariah stared at him like he was a miracle that had wandered back into her life. And the silence flooded her with everything she tried not to remember. She replayed the day her life began to go wrong, from the moment she gave up her son. The day she severed a piece of her own soul and then tried to keep living as if she was still whole. She never said out loud the cruel truth that some right choices still destroy you slowly. And in her mind, the size of her pain became proof of entitlement. She told herself she had suffered enough to earn ownership. Once that belief hardened into something absolute, she became dangerous, not because she wanted to hurt Dominic, but because she was willing to hurt anyone she believed stood between her and what she called a second chance. Abby, backed into a corner by the need to keep Dominic safe, decided to make an emotional plea on video. It wasn't a casual appeal, it was an act of raw courage and quiet humiliation. Because Abby understood that a mother who begs in public is placing her heart on display and gambling that truth and emotion might reach the one person who needed to hear it. She never wanted her private life turned into spectacle, but she had run out of options. She needed Dominic protected. She needed Mariah to stop before the damage became irreversible. Abby chose each word like stepping across a rope bridge, careful not to push Mariah deeper into extremity, careful not to sound weak enough to invite further invasion. Her voice carried the tremor of exhaustion, the redness of nights without sleep, the ache of being torn between loyalty to a family member and the fierce instinct to defend her child. Even without shouting, the plea landed with the weight of someone speaking from the edge of a cliff. Please stop before Dominic is dragged into the darkest place adults create. But Mariah didn't soften. She hardened. She delivered a chilling vow to Dominic, not in the gentle shape of a promise, but like a brand pressed onto the child's future. In Mariah's mind, truth was both weapon and salvation. The worst moment came when she told Dominic everything, that she was his real mother. There is no way for a child to receive that without shaking. Dominic might not have fully understood biology, but he understood the one thing that mattered. The adults he trusted had been hiding something terrible. And now that secret was thrown at him like a stone. Dominic's world wobbled. Words turned into ghosts. He could look at Abby and Devin with an expression that didn't fit his age, as if silently asking who he was, where he belonged, and why the truth had to arrive like a threat instead of love. After that, Mariah became haunted by a recurring dream of Dominic running away. In the dream, he ran on small legs, fleeing voices calling after him, fleeing hands reaching for him, fleeing even Mariah. It wasn't only fear of losing him, it was her own mind punishing her for turning love into pressure. She woke up violently, heart racing, skin slick with cold sweat, the warning clinging to her like a second shadow. Yet instead of seeing it as a sign to stop, Mariah took it as confirmation that if she loosened her grip, Dominic would disappear from her forever. And so the spiral tightened. The more she feared losing him, the harder she clung, the harder she clung. The more Dominic feared, the more Dominic feared. The more Mariah convinced herself that only she could keep him. It was sick logic, but too consistent for Mariah to recognize it as destruction. Dominic still slept in the back seat during the rare stretches of quiet, and that quiet somehow made everything hurt worse. He slept as if he didn't know he was standing at the center of a war he couldn't understand. Abby watched him and felt her chest ache with helplessness. Children should be protected from adult truths, from terrifying vows, from invisible tug-of-war. Devin couldn't take his eyes off Dominic either, afraid that one moment of distraction would be enough for Dominic to be pulled out of safety. Mariah, staring at Dominic asleep, convinced herself this was fate returning what had been stolen, that everything she did was justified because it was fueled by love. But love was not enough to excuse possession. When Mariah insisted Dominic was her son and refused to let go, she wasn't only fighting Abby and Devin, she was fighting the reality that Dominic was not a lost object to reclaim, but a person growing into himself, learning trust, learning what it meant to call somewhere home. The tension reached its most terrifying point when Mariah declared she would rather die than let anyone take Dom from her again. The words sliced through the air like a blade. Abby went cold. Devin felt the threat stop being hypothetical. Because when someone makes death a condition, they have stepped onto the edge of an uncontainable desperation. Abby no longer knew what Mariah might do next, only that every move now had to be calculated, like defusing a bomb. Devin felt it too. He wanted to protect Dominic, but he also knew that cornering Mariah might turn her vow into action. No one could pretend that this was simply an emotional breakdown anymore. It had become a tense battle where everyone was stretched between love and fear, compassion and survival. What was right and what was safe? Abby clung to the hope that her video plea might reach the part of Mariah that was still human, still capable of stepping back. Devin forced himself to stay rational, refusing to let anger sabotage the last chance to de-escalate. Mariah only grew more convinced she was being attacked, more certain the world was unfair, more determined that after everything she had lost, she would not lose again. Dominic, even without saying much, began carrying an invisible fear inside him, fear of sleeping alone, fear of sudden noises, fear of adult eyes changing. And that fear was the cruelest proof that the situation had already crossed the line. That night, as Abby sat alone staring at her phone screen, reading reactions to her video, she didn't feel relief. She felt a cold emptiness. Devin stepped in beside her, equally silent, because both of them understood. No amount of carefully chosen words could defeat a chilling vow if the person making it had fused their entire identity to it. Somewhere else, Mariah jolted awake again, hearing the echo of Dominic's footsteps running farther and farther away in her mind. She grabbed onto the only thought that kept her from collapsing. Dominic was her son, Dominic would not leave her, and no one would take him from her. But when she turned to glance into the back seat to reassure herself he was still there, her eyes met a wrong kind of emptiness. A silence that didn't belong because the back seat was no longer holding Dominic at all. Abby's hands shook before she even pressed record, not because she doubted what she had to do, but because she understood the humiliation stitched into it, the kind that settles on a person when private terror becomes public necessity. She had always believed that if you loved someone hard enough, if you protected a child fiercely enough, you could keep the worst possibilities at bay. Yet now she was staring at a phone camera like it was a lifeline, forced to admit that her family's safety had slipped beyond the reach of closed doors and whispered reassurances. Tears came fast, not staged and not strategic, but because the fear inside her had nowhere else to go. The video became her only way to widen the circle of protection around Dominic, to turn strangers into extra sets of eyes, to create a net large enough to catch a child who might appear anywhere, at any moment, under conditions she couldn't control. She spoke as a mother first, not as someone trying to craft the perfect message, and the rawness of her grief was its own kind of clarity. She acknowledged the truth she could no longer dodge, that she knew Dominic was with Mariah, and she did it carefully, almost painfully so. Because the very act of naming Mariah as part of this nightmare threatened to ignite new misunderstandings and new panic. Abby tried to hold the narrative steady, tried to anchor it in the one thing Dominic might still cling to if he saw it: familiarity. She insisted that Dominic did not need to be afraid because Mariah had once been their friend, because Mariah had once been someone safe, because Abby needed Dominic to keep breathing, keep hoping, keep believing that the people who loved him were not gone forever. It was a thin thread, but Abby offered it anyway, even as her own heart screamed that friendship, history, and love were not always enough to stop someone who had been broken into something unrecognizable. She confessed how much she and Devin missed Dominic, not as a dramatic flourish, but as a reminder of gravity, as if saying it out loud could pull Dominic back toward home the way the wind tugs the tide. Abby tried to make the plea feel less like a warning and more like a map. She spoke about waiting, about the home that still existed for him, about the arms that still belonged to him, because she couldn't bear the idea that Dominic might interpret this situation as abandonment. The most delicate part was the way Abby tried to recruit the public without making Dominic feel hunted. She framed it as a hope, not an alarm. A child on an adventure, not a kidnapping, a chance encounter, not a manhunt. She begged, through trembling breath, that if any of their friends or anyone at all caught sight of Dominic, they would understand that he was loved, that people were waiting, that there was a place he belonged that had never stopped calling his name. Behind the softness of her language, though, was a tension so sharp it threatened to cut her from the inside out. Every word Abby chose had a double purpose: to keep Dominic calm if he saw it, and to keep the world alert if they didn't. She felt trapped in that impossible balance. Too much fear might frighten Dominic into hiding. Too little fear might keep someone from acting fast enough. The tears on her face weren't just grief, they were calculations cost. She hated that she had to speak in coded gentleness, hated that motherhood had become a kind of crisis management where even love had to be carefully measured. Devin wasn't in front of the camera, but his presence haunted the edges of the moment. Abby could feel the absence of Dominic like a missing organ, and she could feel Devin carrying his own version of that absence harder, tighter, filled with self-blame he would never say out loud. Abby's video wasn't only for Dominic and the public. It was also a quiet attempt to hold Devin together, to give him something to do besides replay every decision that led them here. Abby understood that Devin's love for Dominic was fierce in a way that didn't always translate into words. It showed in the way he paced, the way he watched the door, the way his jaw locked whenever Mariah's name surfaced. He wanted action, solutions, results, but Abby's approach was different. She wanted connection, a human bridge back to Dominic. A reminder to Mariah and anyone watching that Dominic was not a prize to be won, but a child with a home already built around him. Abby felt herself splitting into versions of who she needed to be: a mother offering comfort, a woman swallowing rage, a partner trying to keep Devin's fear from turning into recklessness. She chose the video because it was the least violent form of power she had left. As the message spread outward, the situation tightened in a different direction. Sharon Newman arrived at last, and her timing alone carried the weight of inevitability, like a door finally opening after a long stretch of suffocating silence. She didn't come with theatrical certainty. She came with the quiet dread of someone who knew too well how quickly a life could collapse once the wrong person made the wrong choice. Sharon's presence sharpened the room, because she represented history: families splintered and mended, crises survived and never fully forgotten. She also represented something Abby couldn't afford to dismiss: perspective on Mariah that went deeper than the immediate emergency. Sharon didn't need to say that this wasn't only about Dominic being missing. It was about Mariah's fracture widening into something dangerous, something unpredictable, something that had been forming for longer than anyone wanted to admit. And Sharon did not come alone. She arrived with Detective Burrow, newly joined to the GCPD, and that detail mattered because it changed the temperature of everything. This was no longer a private family crisis being managed with pleading calls and fragile hope. This was official now, structured now, propelled into the machinery of law enforcement and procedure. It meant resources, yes, but it also meant scrutiny, pressure, and the terrifying possibility that one wrong move could push Mariah into a corner she would fight her way out of. Detective Burrow did not waste time romanticizing what had happened. He listened, observed, and asked for the parts people tried to slide past because those parts were uncomfortable. He looked past the surface, past Abby's tears, past Devin's anger, past Sharon's anxiety, and aimed straight at the center: Mariah's state of mind and the fault lines that had been there long before Dominic vanished. Burrow's approach wasn't cruel, but it was relentless in the way truth can be. He wanted to know about the distance Mariah had carried after the surrogacy, the subtle shifts that might have seemed harmless at the time, the emotional detachment that might have been a warning sign rather than a phase. He wanted specifics, not because he enjoyed digging into pain, but because patterns matter in cases like this. Abby felt exposed answering those questions. She didn't want to dissect Mariah like a suspect. She wanted to believe Mariah could still be reached. Yet Abby also understood that if Dominic was to be found quickly and safely, they couldn't pretend this was a simple misunderstanding. Every detail about Mariah's behavior was potentially a roadmap. The conversation inevitably moved toward the darker corners of Mariah's past, and the air in the room grew heavier when the subject of her time in a cult surfaced. Abby hated the way that history sounded when placed under fluorescent investigative light, like a label, like a verdict, like a shortcut to blame. Sharon's expression tightened, not because she wanted to condemn Mariah, but because she knew how trauma can bend and reshape a person in ways that reappear under stress. Burrow's interest in that past wasn't sensational. It was strategic. If Mariah had once been trained directly or indirectly to distrust outsiders, to resist authority, to see pursuit as persecution, then she might respond to police attention by escalating her flight. Burrow needed to anticipate that. Abby felt torn again, because part of her wanted to protect Mariah from being reduced to her worst scars. But the larger part, the mother part, wanted every possible advantage stacked in Dominic's favor. Sharon's role in the room was complex. She carried concern for Dominic, empathy for Abby and Devin, and a deep, private fear for Mariah that she couldn't quite voice without sounding like she was making excuses. Sharon knew Mariah's vulnerabilities, the way guilt could rot into obsession if left unchecked, the way fear could become a kind of fuel. She also knew that the public video Abby released would land inside Mariah's mind like a hammer. If Mariah saw it, would it soften her, make her feel seen and invited back? Or would it make her feel exposed, cornered, and humiliated, triggering the very instincts that had once helped her survive darker environments? Sharon could not be sure, and that uncertainty made her even more determined to stand close to this crisis rather than letting it spiral without her. Burrow, with his experience, spoke in the language of probabilities and behavior. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His steadiness did that. He made it clear that Mariah would likely attempt to avoid direct confrontation and that she might try to keep Dominic quiet, hidden, and moving. Abby absorbed those implications with a nausea she struggled to hide. She pictured Dominic confused, tired, sensing tension in every adult breath around him, and she had to fight not to collapse under the image. Devin, listening, felt his anger sharpen into something dangerous and urged to do something immediate, physical, decisive. Abby watched him carefully, because she knew Devin's love could turn into a storm if he felt powerless too long. She also knew that if Devin acted on instinct instead of strategy, he could make things worse. Mariah might panic. Dominic might get caught in the shockwave. Abby's tears dried, replaced by a cold focus that frightened her with its intensity. Fear had shifted shape. It was becoming resolve. Somewhere out there, beyond the walls of that room, Mariah was still moving, still calculating, still trying to stay ahead of the tightening circle. She had not surrendered to the idea that she could simply hand Dominic back and step away. The more the world reacted, the more she felt hunted, and the more she felt hunted, the more she convinced herself that running was proof she was right. In her mind, the police weren't rescuers. They were thieves arriving with badges. Abby's video wasn't a plea. It was propaganda meant to turn Dominic against her. Every attempt to locate her became, to Mariah, an attempt to erase her claim. That distortion made her stubborn, slippery, and increasingly reckless. She would find a way to evade pursuit because evasion had become her identity in this moment. She didn't see herself as a criminal. She saw herself as a mother refusing to be erased again. But Burrow was not new to this kind of desperation. Experience had taught him that people on the run betray themselves through patterns, the need for rest, the need for supplies, the impulse to reach out to someone they trust. The small predictable choices that happen when panic and exhaustion collide. Burrow didn't pretend Mariah couldn't vanish for a while. She could, and she might. Yet he also made it clear, in the quiet confidence of someone who had seen many fugitives believe they were smarter than they were, that she would have limits. Abby clung to that word, limits, as if it were a lifeline. Limits meant time worked in their favor, if they acted correctly. Limits meant Mariah couldn't keep Dominic hidden forever without slipping. Limits meant hope could be anchored to something more solid than prayer. The tension in the situation wasn't only about distance on a map. It was about the psychological distance widening between who Mariah was and who everyone needed her to be. Abby felt grief for Mariah even while she feared her. That contradiction tore at Abby's insides because it made her feel guilty for being angry and angry for feeling guilty. Abby wanted Dominic home, but she also wanted a version of Mariah that could come back from this without shattering completely. And Abby hated herself for caring about that second part when her son was still missing. Devin's conflict was different. He felt no obligation to protect Mariah from consequences, not when Dominic's safety was on the line. He was willing to accept that Mariah might never be the same in their lives again if that was the price of getting Dominic back. Abby heard that in Devin's silence, in the way he held himself rigid as Burrow spoke, in the way his eyes seemed to sharpen whenever Mariah's name was treated like a person instead of a threat. Abby understood Devon's stance, even if it hurt. Love for Devon had become defense. Burrow pressed again for any indication of where Mariah might go, but the information available was limited, and that uncertainty fed the dread. Sharon watched Abby's face, seeing a mother trying not to break in real time, and she kept herself steady because someone had to. Sharon also knew the public video could create its own momentum. Someone might recognize Dominic, someone might report a sighting. But that same publicity could also push Mariah into deeper hiding, could make her feel betrayed by the very community she once belonged to. Abby had made a choice that couldn't be undone, and now they were living in the consequences of that choice, praying it would save Dominic faster than it endangered him. As hours dragged forward, Abby's hope became a sharp, restless thing. Every phone vibration felt like a possible miracle or a new nightmare. Devon remained close, but his presence was heavy with restrained fury, as though he was holding himself back from tearing the world apart to find his son. Sharon stayed, unwilling to leave Abby alone in that kind of fear. Burrow moved with purpose, tracking leads, connecting fragments, following the invisible trail that fugitives think they don't leave behind. Abby tried to trust that process, but trust was difficult when her child was somewhere unknown, possibly hearing things he shouldn't have to hear, possibly absorbing fear he shouldn't have to carry. And still, in the midst of all this, one reality remained: Mariah was running, and she was not likely to stop until something forced her hand. Abby knew that, Sharon knew that, Burrow knew that. The only question was what would force it: exhaustion, a mistake, a moment of softness, or the tightening grip of law enforcement. Abby's video had cast a spotlight across the world. Burrow's experience had begun to narrow the search into something focused and methodical. Sharon's arrival had brought old knowledge into the room, the kind that could illuminate what no report ever would. Devon's anger had become a storm barely contained. The pressure was building from every direction, and Abby could feel that they were moving toward a moment when the situation would either resolve or explode. By the time night pressed against the windows, Abby's earlier tears felt like they belonged to a different person. She was still terrified, but the terror had sharpened into a kind of grim clarity. Dominic needed to come home. That was the only truth she could hold without losing herself. Sharon sat nearby, quiet but present, her own mind turning over every detail of Mariah's past and present, trying to predict what she might do next. Devon stood like a guard at the edge of his own restraint. Burrow's phone rang, then rang again, and Abby's heart jumped each time, because in every ring she heard the possibility of Dominic's name being spoken aloud with certainty. Then Burrow's expression changed, subtle, controlled, but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. He didn't announce anything dramatically. He didn't have to. The shift in his posture was enough to make Abby's blood run cold. He listened, asked a brief question, and ended the call with a calm that felt like a warning. Abby's breath caught as she searched his face for meaning, because she knew that calm could mean only one thing. They had something. A lead, a sighting, a pattern, a break. Burrow looked toward Sharon first, then toward Abby and Devon, and in that silence Abby felt the floor tilt again, the way it always did when the next chapter of a nightmare was about to begin. Burrow finally spoke with measured certainty, not offering comfort, only reality. The search was tightening, Mariah had made a move, and the next step would happen fast. Abby's pulse hammered so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. Because whatever Burrow had just learned meant Dominic was no longer only missing. Dominic was suddenly close enough to be found, or close enough for Mariah to panic and run harder. And Abby realized, with a sick dread that made her hands go numb, that the moment Mariah understood the police were truly on her trail would be the moment she might do something irreversible. On our TV Spoilers channel, I always seek content inspiration for each video by compiling short video clips to analyze and offer my personal opinions. This channel specializes in analyzing, theorizing, and and discussing plot points in The Young and the Restless series from the perspective of a longtime fan. Through this, viewers can gain deeper, more objective, and more interesting perspectives. Subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the latest news about The Young and the Restless series.